Picture the safety of your own home. The door swings shut. The world stays outside. You are safe. That feeling is the oldest comfort a human being has ever known. Now, set it on fire. Your medieval house is not a shelter. It is a slow machine built to kill you. The walls do not keep the outside out. They breathe, they crawl. They hold nests of things that move only in the dark. The floor is not a foundation. It is a grave in layers. Every crumb ever dropped. Every splash of spilled ale. Every foul thing your body has ever released, pressed down under your feet and rotting. The air itself is poison, black, greasy. It coats your lungs like tar, one breath at a time until they turn to leather. Your real enemy is one you cannot see. An army with no face, no name you understand, no weakness you can strike. Parasites, your wisest scholars swear, are born from your own sinful flesh. Worms as long as your hand, thriving in your gut, because holy men taught you to feed the garden with your own waste. Bacteria, riding in the water you trust, emptying you from the inside until nothing remains. This force lives in your walls, in your cup, under your skin, and it has already won. This is the story of a war that could not be won, fought on three impossible fronts. The first was the house, an execution chamber wearing the mask of a home. The second was the body, a living nest of disease that bred its own tormentors. The third was the mind, a cage of superstition that turned every reach for salvation into a faster path to the grave. This is not a story about dirty people. It is the story of why the word clean was a lethal fantasy, and why every single step toward it pulled them deeper into the dirt. Tell us which city and country you are watching from in the comments below. And if you believe these stories deserve to be told, take a moment to subscribe and support the project. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. Kneel down and look at the ground beneath a peasant's feet. There are no planks. There are no flagstones. There is only the floor, and the floor is alive. It begins as packed earth, beaten flat by generations of bare heels. Over that, someone scatters a handful of straw or rushes cut from the river's edge. When the straw turns black with filth, no one sweeps it away. They throw a fresh layer on top, then another, then another. Season after season, year after year, the floor rises. A mat of rot builds up under their feet, thicker than a man's hand is wide. Cut a cross-section through it, and you would read the family's whole history in stripes. A band of spilled ale from last winter, gone black and sticky with mold. The gnawed bones of a rabbit, half dissolved. A layer of dog filth, a layer of vomit. The dried phlegm of a grandfather dying of a cough. Everything that fell, dripped, or left a human body stayed, pressed flat by daily footsteps, left to rot inches from where the children slept. Archaeologists have a name for this. They call it the occupation layer. At Warham Percy in Yorkshire, a village emptied after the plagues, excavators sliced through these floors and found them exactly as described. Compacted, layered, dense with the debris of lives that ended and were forgotten. They found the post holes of the houses, the drains of the byres, and the churchyard where the villagers went into the ground. Nearly 700 skeletons came out of that one small parish, and every one of them had lived on a floor like this. The Dutch scholar Erasmus saw the living version firsthand when he crossed to England in the early 1500s. He was a guest of the great and the comfortable, not the poor, and still he was repelled. In a letter to the physician of Cardinal Wolsey, he wrote that the rushes were laid so poorly that the bottom layer went undisturbed for 20 years. Beneath it, he said, lay spit, vomit, the leavings of dogs and men, spilled beer, scraps of fish, and filth he refused to name. He blamed these floors, in part, for the sweating sickness that swept England 5 times and killed strong men within hours of the first shiver. He advised opening windows, thinning the crowds, and stripping the old rushes. He was closer to the truth than he knew. This was not only a matter of smell, though visitors described the stench like a fist to the face. This was a machine, warm, damp, packed with rotting matter, a nursery for bacteria that never closed. Tetanus spores from animal dung waited in the fibers, patient, needing only a small cut on a bare foot to wake. Salmonella bred in the decaying food scraps. Fleas and lice buried their eggs deep in the mat, feeding an infestation that rose out of the ground and never stopped. In summer, the fleas rose in clouds when a foot disturbed the straw, and in winter, the lice moved from body to body under the shared blankets. There was no season of rest from them. A baby learning to crawl moved across this, palms pressing into pathogens, fingers going straight to the mouth. This is one reason so many children never saw their 5th birthday. Study the bones from medieval churchyards, and you find the same pattern everywhere. Nearly half of all people buried died before they reached adulthood. At Warham Percy, the small graves clustered close to the church wall, where mothers laid their infants near the drip of the holy roof, hoping the falling rainwater would carry a blessing onto the child below. The floor was not something you stood on. It was something that killed your children. Now lift your eyes and try to take a breath. In the middle of the single room burns the hearth, a ring of stones, a fire of wood or peat, smoldering through the day and never fully out at night. There is no chimney. The chimney was a luxury still centuries from reaching the poor. William Harrison, writing in the reign of Elizabeth, remembered old men in his own village who marveled at the new chimneys and said that in their youth, smoke was thought to harden the timbers and toughen the men who breathed it. They were wrong. A small gap in the thatch lets a little smoke escape. The rest stays. It fills the room with a stinging fog that never lifts, so that a man standing tall breathes worse air than a man crouched near the floor. The air is greasy. It is black. Modern scientists have measured what such an environment does to human lungs, and the number is grim. Living here was like smoking several packs of tobacco a day, from your first breath to your last. The smoke touched everything. It soaked into the wool on your back. It filled the straw of your mattress. It worked into the grain of the one table you owned and into the pores of your skin. A film of grime nothing could wash off. It stained the rafters black and hung soot in long threads from the beams, so that a slammed door could shake a fall of black flakes down onto the food. Worst of all, it lined your lungs with tar. When these skeletons are studied, the ribs and sinuses tell the story. Chronic infection, ruined breathing, sinus disease so common it was almost universal. Your own home smothered you a little more with every breath. The fire killed 2 ways: slow, through the smoke; fast, through the flame. An open hearth in a crowded room was a standing danger. People, animals, straw, wool, all packed close around live coals. The coroner's rolls of the age repeat the same small tragedies over and over, because English law demanded an inquest for every sudden death, and demanded the finder raise the hue and cry. Read them, and you meet the dead by name. In a Bedfordshire roll, a girl of 3, left beside the fire while her mother crossed the yard for water, tips into the flames, and is dead before the neighbors reach her. In another, a laborer drops asleep by his hearth after a day at the plough and never wakes, the smoke and the drink together. In a London roll, a woman named Alice stirs a cauldron over the fire. Her sleeve catches, and she burns before anyone can beat out the flames. A jury of neighbors was summoned to view each body, name the cause, and record the deodand, the very object that killed. The cauldron, the cart, the open flame. These were not rare accidents. They were the rhythm of ordinary life, written down by clerks who had seen it all before. The most common horror was the simplest: a pot of boiling water or pottage balanced on the stones. One careless second, and it tips. Gallons of scalding liquid pour onto whoever stands near. In a world with no burn ward and no clean bandage, that was a death sentence written in minutes. The coroner's rolls list them as death by scalding over and over. And most of the victims are small children who crawled toward the one warm thing in the room. Then there was the death that took the whole family at once. A single ember, carried up on the smoke. It settles on the underside of the thatch. That thatch is dried straw. For years, it has drunk in the greasy soot from the fire below. It does not smolder. It ignites. In seconds, the whole ceiling becomes a sheet of flame, dropping fire onto the people asleep beneath it. Whole towns understood this terror. In 1212, fire tore through London and trapped a crowd on the wooden bridge between two walls of flame, and by some accounts thousands died there, crushed and burned together. After that, the city ordered roofs of tile instead of thatch, and forbade the alehouses to keep straw. It ordered every household to keep a barrel of water and a hook to pull down a burning roof before the fire spread. The order was for the rich and the merchant. In the villages, the straw stayed, and so did the danger, generation after generation. The thing that kept them from freezing in January was the same thing that could burn them alive in their beds. The walls gave no shelter either. They were never built to keep the world out. They were built to let it move in. Most peasant homes were wattle-and-daub. First, a lattice of woven hazel sticks, sprung between upright posts sunk into the earth. Then a thick plaster smeared over it, inside and out, worked in by hand and boot. That plaster was wet soil, clay, sand, and a binder. The binder was almost always animal dung, sometimes mixed with straw and horsehair to hold it fast. Their houses were built, in part, from waste, and everyone knew it, because the smell of it clung to the new wall for weeks. This wall was not smooth. It was not sealed. It was a sponge. It drank the endless rain through the untrimmed thatch above and stayed cold and wet inside. Mold bloomed across it in black and green patches right beside the sleeping family. But its worst treachery was its welcome to vermin. Rats and mice tunneled into the soft mixture, running networks of passages just behind the surface. Fleas, lice, beetles, and spiders bred inside the wall itself. You did not keep pests in your home. Your home was the pest. The scratching you heard in the dark was not outside. It was in the wall, an inch from your ear, where the carriers of plague and fever lived out their lives in the slum you called shelter. They were not intruders. They were tenants. We know now what those tenants carried. The black rat, the one that thrived in wattle and daub, hosted the flea that carried Yersinia pestis. The plague. When it came in 1348, it landed at the port of Melcombe in Dorset, carried off a ship, and spread inland faster than any horseman could ride. Within 2 years, it had killed perhaps half of England. The chronicler Henry Knighton wrote that the sheep died in the fields in such numbers that no one dared touch the wool, and that whole villages stood empty, the doors swinging open on rooms where no living thing remained. In some places, the dead were tipped into common pits, layer upon layer, because there were not enough living hands left to dig separate graves. The disease traveled through the very walls people had built with their own hands to feel safe. The design made the border between man and nature thinner still. In the 1200s, many families lived in a longhouse, one long room, undivided, sometimes 80 feet from end to end. At one end, the family ate and slept and worked. At the other, the animals were kept for the night, separated only by a shallow gutter cut into the floor to carry off the muck. The cow, the pigs, the chickens. In the dark, a child could reach out and feel the warm flank of the family ox rise and fall. This was no picture of country peace. It was a fuse waiting to burn. The animals gave off warmth, yes, but they gave off far more than that. You slept a few feet from a cow that might carry bovine tuberculosis, a wasting sickness that would eat your lungs over years. You breathed the same air as pigs that could carry anthrax, a germ that could slip through a small cut and turn your blood to poison. Brucellosis rose invisibly from the fluids of a birthing animal, drifting into your lungs as you slept, leaving joint pain and fevers that came back for the rest of your life. Milk drawn by hand into an unwashed pail carried its own load of sickness straight to the children who drank it first. The dust of dried dung, swept up when the byre was cleaned, hung in the air the whole family shared. The air was not only thick with smoke, it was a broth of animal dander, of unseen fecal dust, of the constant breath of creatures carrying diseases you had no name for and no cure against. Your home was not a fortress. It was a dish designed to pass sickness from one species to another, night after night. The last betrayal came from the thing you needed most: water. Look at the layout of a peasant's plot, and you see a lesson in slow self-poisoning. The family dug a well for drinking water. A few paces away, they dug a second hole, the cesspit, an unlined pit in the earth that served as the household toilet, sometimes shared by several homes at once, sometimes overflowing into the lane after heavy rain. The rest is simple. Liquid waste seeped out of the pit. It sank through the soil. It reached the water table, and it flowed inevitably toward the nearby well. The water they hauled up might look clear. It might taste of nothing at all. It was often thick with the bacteria of their own waste. In the towns, it was worse. In London, the butchers of the shambles dumped offal and blood into the streets and the Thames until the stench grew unbearable. In 1349, King Edward III wrote to the mayor, complaining that the air of the city was corrupted and poisoned by the filth, and that men fell sick from the smell of it. He ordered the streets cleared, and the dung carts kept moving. Later, the city hired men called rakers to drag the muck from the lanes, and gong farmers to empty the pits by night, hauling the waste out to great mounds beyond the walls. The order changed little. The waste kept coming because there was nowhere else to put it, and the river that received it was the same river the poor drank from. This was the source of the sickness they called the flux. We call it dysentery, a raging infection of the gut, cramps, fever, diarrhea that turned to blood. The body, fighting to purge the poison, emptied itself of every drop of fluid until dehydration finished the work. It killed kings as readily as peasants. King John died of it in 1216 at Newark, after a hard ride, and, the chroniclers said, a surfeit of peaches and new ale. Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, died of it in 1307 at Berg by Sands, within sight of the border he had spent his life trying to cross. Whole armies were broken by it before they ever met the enemy. At the Siege of Acre, and on a dozen campaigns after, more men died squatting behind the lines than fell to sword or arrow. The flux did not care what crown you wore. Contaminated water did not check a man's rank before it killed him. You drank to ease your thirst, and the water you drank gave you an illness that made it impossible to keep water inside you at all. A closed loop. The floor, the air, the walls, the water. Every part of the home working together toward the same end. A killing room with a doorway and a hearth. What you've just heard is not the history taught in most classrooms. It is not the story of kings and crowns, but of the quiet biological war that shaped ordinary life for millions of forgotten people. This is the kind of history we dig up here, the truth buried under centuries of pretty fiction. These stories matter. They are the ground our modern world stands on, a record of the struggle that carried us this far. If you are one of us, if you believe these truths deserve a voice and deserve to be told with this care for the facts, then join our inner circle. Become part of the lineage. It is our membership club, and it is the engine that keeps this channel alive. The members of the lineage do not only watch our documentaries, they are the patrons who make them possible, giving us the means to do deep, uncompromising research. Join, and you get early access to our new investigations and other perks. More than that, you become part of the team, a guardian of these lost stories. They thought the real dangers were the ones they could see. The wolf at the tree line, the rival lord across the valley, the teeth of a hard winter. The walls they raised to keep those things out turned traitor. The shelter grew its own executioners, but the treason of the walls was only the outer ring of the war. The real fight was not in the house at all. It was closer than that. It was inside their own skin, against an enemy they were feeding and breeding within their own bodies, and they were about to learn that the worst monster was the one no eye could see, the one already living inside them, the one their wisest scholars would swear was sent by God as a punishment for the sins of the flesh. The war never stayed in the house. It traveled with you, because you carried the battlefield under your own skin, and it was already inside the walls of your body. Begin with a murder. On the 29th of December, 1170, 4 knights loyal to King Henry II crossed the threshold of Canterbury Cathedral with their swords drawn. Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, Richard le Breton. They had heard the king rage in Normandy, asking who would rid him of this troublesome priest, and they took the words as an order. They rode for the coast, crossed the Winter Channel, and reached Canterbury by nightfall. They found Archbishop Thomas Becket near the steps to the choir, in the dark, the monks scattering around him like startled birds. The first blow glanced off his shoulder and cut a monk named Edward Grimm, who had thrown up his arm to shield him. Grimm survived and wrote down what he saw. The next blows drove Becket to his knees. He named God and the Virgin and the saints of the church and would not run. The last stroke sheared off the crown of his skull, and Le Breton's sword snapped against the stone floor. A clerk in the party, Hugh of Horsea, pressed his heel to the archbishop's neck and scattered the brains across the pavement, saying the man would rise no more. Then they left him there, the blood seeping into the joints of the flagstones, the candles guttering in the cold. When the monks came to prepare the body, they peeled back the fine robes of the most powerful churchman in England. Underneath, against his skin, he wore a hair shirt and breeches of the same coarse hair, stiff with old sweat and crusted with dried blood from his own scratching. As the corpse cooled on the slab, its hidden tenants began to leave. The chroniclers present describe lice and fleas boiling out of the fabric in a rising tide, a living shroud crawling off the dead man. William Fitzstephen, who had served Becket in life, recorded that the vermin swarmed out like water simmering in a pot. The monks, he wrote, wept and laughed in the same breath, seeing the secret holiness of a man who had hidden such penance beneath his silk. Within 3 years, the Church made him a saint. Pilgrims came in their thousands to kneel where he fell, and Henry himself walked barefoot through the streets to be scourged at the tomb. This was not one strange case. In 1307, when the body of Thomas de Cantilupe, Bishop of Hereford, was examined for sainthood, witnesses swore under oath that his clothing crawled with so many lice a man could gather them by the handful. Cantilupe had died on the road to Rome, in Italy, and his flesh had been boiled from his bones to carry them home. Even the memory of him came wrapped in vermin. The men who testified spoke of it not with disgust, but with wonder, as proof he had scorned the comfort of the flesh. To be devoured by lice in that world was to be marked as one of God's own. Here was the great leveler. The vermin drew no line between a beggar and a bishop. They fed on the sinner and the saint alike. Even the crowned were not spared. When a king lay in state, robed in cloth of gold, the same small creatures moved through the folds of the shroud. Lice clung to the hair and nested in the seams of wool, where the cloth folded and held the body's heat. Fleas lived in the mattress straw and the muck of the floor, coming out in the dark to feed on sleeping skin. They were a constant, maddening itch. Skin broke under fingernails. The scratches wept and turned to sores that never quite healed. And still, no one thought to fight them, because in the medieval mind, these creatures were not an enemy that came from outside. They were a symptom of a rot within. That fatal error had a name. The theory of the four humors, laid down by Hippocrates on the Greek island of Kos, and shaped into a system by Galen in Rome in the 2nd century. It ruled Western medicine for more than 1,000 years. The body was governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Health meant the 4 stood in balance. Sickness, madness, even a sour temper, all came from one fluid running too high or too low. A man was called sanguine, or choleric, or melancholic, by which humor ran strongest in him. The words survive in our speech. The medicine behind them killed. The chief cure for imbalance was to spill the excess. So, they bled. They opened a vein at the elbow and let the blood run into a bowl, sometimes pints of it, weakening a sick man further at the hour he could least afford it. They cupped and they leached. They purged the gut and drained the body of the very fluids it needed to fight. A patient already burning with fever was bled pale and told he was being healed. The physician read the color of the blood, the color of the urine held to the light in a glass flask, the phase of the moon, and pronounced his verdict. It was a closed system that could explain any death and prevent none. Kings kept such men at high wages. The barber surgeons who did the cutting hung bloodied rags outside their shops to dry, and the twisting red and white of those rags survives on the barber's pole to this day. Inside this system, there was no room for a germ, no room for an invader you could not see. So when the scholars looked at the lice on their own bodies, they reached a conclusion that doomed them. Albertus Magnus, teacher of Thomas Aquinas and one of the sharpest minds of the 1200s, wrote it down plainly. Lice were not intruders. They were born from the human body itself, generated, he said, from the corruption gathered at the edge of the pores. Your own flesh gave birth to the things that fed on you. They believed that when the humors soured, the body pushed its waste out through the skin, and that this waste, warmed and dampened, simply came alive. It was the same logic that told them maggots grew from meat, bees from a rotting ox, eels from river mud, and mice from grain left in the dark. It would stand as accepted fact until Francesco Redi sealed meat under gauze in Florence in the 1660s and proved the flies had to land to breed. Until then, the skin was not a wall against the world. It was a factory that built your tormentors from the inside out. Sit with what that belief does to a person. The enemy is not in your shirt. It is in your blood. The itch is not a bite. It is your own spoiled flesh turning against you. You cannot wash the problem off, because the problem is you. This is why ordinary people met infestation with a strange calm. It was as natural as sweat, as unavoidable as bleeding. To the devout, it was holy suffering, proof of the body's sinful nature made visible on the skin. Monks were praised for the lice they endured, and some called them the pearls of God, worn as a badge of humility before their brothers. Thomas Becket, it was said, refused to have his hair shirt changed no matter how it swarmed. To the physician, infestation was a clue, a reading of which humor had gone wrong. To everyone, it meant the war could not be won. You cannot beat an enemy your own cells are building. They tried anyway. Every attempt, bent through the lens of the humors, became a slow poisoning. Against head lice, they ground a powder from the herbs staves acre and parsley. But the thing that actually killed the lice was not the herb. It was the metal mixed into it. Mercury. They rubbed a neurotoxin into their scalps, a finger's width from the brain. The skin drank it in. Then came the tremors, the lost memory, the failing kidneys, the loosened teeth and the blackened gums, the slide into madness. They drove themselves insane to kill a creature they thought their own bodies were making. A visible poison against an invisible enemy, killing the host to reach the parasite. The same mercury they later smeared on the sores of syphilis, giving rise to the grim line that a night with Venus meant a lifetime with Mercury. Some tried a comb of fine bone or boxwood, its teeth set so close a louse could not slip through. Archaeologists pull these combs from the mud of London and York by the hundred, and under the microscope, the old teeth still hold the eggs, cemented to the wood centuries ago. Every household owned one. It sat by the bed and was drawn through the hair each morning, then wiped on the sleeve. Not one of them ever won the war. The siege ran deeper than the skin. Inside the gut, a hidden epidemic drained the strength from millions. Paleopathology, the study of disease in old bones and old soil, has cracked this world open. A study out of Cambridge examined the ground beneath the latrines of a medieval Augustinian friary, then compared it to the cesspits of the ordinary townsfolk nearby. Researchers sifted the ancient soil, softened the buried eggs, and counted them under the lens. The result turned every assumption over. The friars lived by rule. They had built stone latrines with channels of running water beneath the seats. They had basins for washing their hands, laid down in their own statutes and enforced by the prior. By every logic, they should have been the healthier men. They were not. The monks carried intestinal worms at nearly twice the rate of the poorer people in the same streets. Close to 7 in 10 of them were infected. The reason is a lesson in good intentions ending in horror. The friary kept large vegetable gardens to feed the community through the long fasts of the church year, when meat was forbidden and the brothers lived on roots and greens. To fertilize the soil, they used the contents of their own latrines, dug out and spread by the lay brothers season after season. They gathered their own infected waste by hand and worked it into the ground where their next meal would grow. The eggs of roundworm and whipworm clung to the carrots and the cabbage leaves. Washing in a bucket of standing water did little against a load like that. The monks ate the eggs. The eggs hatched in the gut. The worms grew, mated, and laid thousands more. Those eggs left the body into the latrine, were collected by the same dutiful hands, and returned to the garden to start the circle again. With prayer and discipline, they had built a closed loop of self-infection. They were farming parasites in their own bellies and calling it good husbandry. The cleaner the house, the sicker the men. And these were no small creatures. The common roundworm, Ascaris lumbricoides, could grow as long as a man's forearm, 30 centimeters and more, pale and thick as a finger. A heavy load of them brought malnutrition, blocked the bowel, and killed slowly as the worms ate what the body needed to live. In a bad case, they climbed. They crawled up the throat in the night. They came out through the mouth and nose of the dying, coiling on the sheet. The whipworm, smaller, burrowed into the wall of the gut and bled it drop by drop, hour by hour. The cures were as empty as those for lice. Physicians prescribed potions of powdered mole, or the ashes of a burnt scorpion swallowed down, or a girdle of dried wormwood tied at the waist, or words of prayer written on a scrap of parchment and eaten whole. They did nothing but add to the suffering. This endless assault, from the outside and from within, broke something in the mind. When the enemy is everywhere, inescapable, and misread from the start, the last move left is not to fight. It is to surrender, and to rename the horror as something holy. That brings us to Catherine of Genoa, a mystic of the 1400s, born Caterina Fieschi into one of the great families of that city. Married young to a man who wasted her fortune and her peace. She turned from the life of a lady to the life of a nurse, and gave herself to the sick and the dying in the great hospital of the port, the Pamatone. When the plague of 1493 swept Genoa and killed 4 in 5 of those it touched, she stayed and worked, while the rich fled to their villas in the hills. She caught the fever herself from the lips of a dying woman she tried to save, and survived it. She moved through wards thick with the smell of rot and fever, wiping bodies no one else would touch, closing the eyes of the dead with her own hands. One account tells of a patient so overrun with lice that Catherine, for once, felt her stomach turn. Revulsion rose in her throat, and in that moment of weakness, she believed she heard the voice of God. The command was not to clean the man, not to pray for his healing. The command was to take a handful of the lice from his body and put them in her mouth and eat them. And she did. Her biographers set this down as the highest victory of faith over the flesh, of holiness over disgust, and the Church would raise her to sainthood on the strength of such acts, 3 centuries after her death. Look closer, and it is the opposite. It is total surrender. The siege had grown so complete that the only way the mind could survive was to redefine being devoured as an act of worship. You do not defeat the enemy. You swallow it. You take the thing that consumes you and call your submission a sacrament. This was the end of the war for the single body. The parasites had won, and their victory was dressed as grace and carved onto altars. The book at the root of this whole investigation is an archive of buried terror. It is a masterwork of research into the physical and mental reality of this age, digging further into the truth than anything I have read. It built the foundation of today's story, and to feel the full weight of this lost world, you should hold it yourself. It is available right now Tap the View Products button on your screen and you will find it there, waiting. But it does not stand alone. We have gathered a set of other immersive pieces, dark relics drawn from the stories we tell. Open the shop shelf and see what waits for you. These are not ordinary products. They are artifacts that let you hold a fragment of this history in your own hand. Tap the button now and browse them while we go deeper. The single person was a lost cause, a walking ecosystem of decay. But something changed when you took millions of these besieged bodies and pressed them together behind one ring of stone. When the private hell of the peasant longhouse was scaled up to the size of London, a city of 40,000 souls, where the houses leaned so close across the lanes that neighbors could shake hands from opposite upper windows, where the sun never reached the cobbles, where a single open channel down the middle of the street carried rainwater, kitchen slop, and human waste, past every door toward a river that gave the city its drink. What rose then was not simply a bigger death trap. It was a new kind of creature, a single organism made of filth, hunger, and crowding, an engine that would not only breed its own plagues, but throw open the gates and welcome them inside. The war for the body was finished. The war for the city was about to begin. A single body was a walking ruin. But a society is not a heap of separate bodies. It is one living thing, with its own veins, its own hunger, its own waste. Pack tens of thousands of these besieged bodies behind one wall, and the private horror of the peasant hut swells to the size of a nightmare. What you get is not a bigger trap. It is a single organism built of filth, an engine that breeds its own plagues and then opens the door and calls them in. This is the medieval city. By the middle of the 1300s, London held around 40,000 people inside a wall the Romans had first raised 1,000 years before. The houses had climbed upward for want of room, 3 and 4 stories, each floor jutting out further than the one below, until the roofs nearly touched above the lane. Down at street level, the sun rarely landed. A man walking the narrow gut of a street-like stinking lane, named for its butchers, moved through a permanent brown dusk, his shoulders brushing the walls on either side, his feet finding the raised stones set down the middle so the muck could run past on both sides. The city had ordinances against tipping waste in the street. It hired scavengers to cart it away. Neither kept pace. The filth won every year. Do not imagine these people wanted to be dirty. They did not. They longed to be clean. In London, dozens of public bathhouses stood open for business. They called them stews. For a few coins, a man could lower himself into a wide wooden tub of steaming water, sometimes with a board laid across it to hold his cup and his bread. A comfort no rural peasant would ever taste. Here, you would think, was the front line where the war on filth might finally be won. It was a trap dressed as a rescue. One question undid the whole promise. Where did the water come from? The Thames. The same river that carried the city's ships and trade also carried its sewage. Into it went the chamber pots of 10,000 homes, emptied from upper windows with a shout of warning to anyone below. Into it went the blood and guts sluiced from the butchers of the shambles. So much of it that in 1343, the crown ordered the slaughtering moved outside the walls, and the order was ignored, and had to be given again and again for the next 100 years. Into it ran the acid runoff of the tanneries, where hides soaked for months in pits of dog dung and stale urine to loosen the hair. Even the water carriers, the men who hauled it up in yoked buckets to sell door to door, drew it from the same current that the tide pushed the waste back up twice a day. That was the water they hauled to fill the bathing tubs. You were not soaking away the grime. you were steeping in a warm broth of the whole city's waste. The lie went deeper. Many of the famous bathhouses across the river in Southwark stood on land owned and licensed by the Bishop of Winchester himself, whose great palace rose on the same bank with its own private wharf on the river. They ran openly as brothels, 18 of them lining the waterfront, and their women were known in the streets as the Winchester geese. The bishop's own rules laid down what the women could charge and forbade any to be held against her will, so that lust was regulated by law and taxed by the church in the same breath. When one of them died, she was refused burial in consecrated ground, and laid instead in an unmarked plot they called the crossbones, a corner of unhallowed earth where the outcast dead went into the mud without a stone. The same tub of water served dozens of bodies in a day, changed rarely, filtered never. It passed skin infections, fevers, and the pox from stranger to stranger. The man who guarded the purity of the soul took his rent from a trade that guaranteed the ruin of the body. You walked into the stews to wash. You walked out carrying the diseases of 100 people you never met, all of it blessed by the quiet prophet of the church. The city itself was built to rot. The sheer weight of waste from tens of thousands of people was a problem they answered the only way they knew. They gathered it into pits. Every household of any means dug one in the yard or the cellar, and the men who emptied them, the gong farmers, could only work by night when the streets were empty. They were paid 4 times a laborer's wage because the work could kill them. They lowered themselves by rope into the dark, stood to the waist in the muck, hauled it up in barrels by candlelight, and carted it out through the gates before dawn to the great dung heaps by the marshes at the edge of the city. A guild record names one such man, buried at company expense, dead of the fumes at the bottom of a pit he had gone down to clear. The heaps they built outside the wall grew so vast that one, the lay stall at the edge of Moorfields, became a landmark men steered by. In 1326, a man remembered as Richard the Raker worked at emptying a public latrine in London. The floorboards under him had been eaten for years by acid fumes and damp. They broke. He fell into the pit beneath, 12 feet deep, a still black lake of human waste. He drowned in it, alone in the dark, before anyone could reach him. The city clerks wrote it down without alarm. It was simply the risk of the work. Other names survive in the court rolls for the same reason. Neighbors dragged before the assize because their cesspit had seeped through a shared wall and flooded the room next door. A man named William fined because the reek of his pit had driven the tenant above him from his bed. 2 men taken to court for piping their waste into a neighbor's cellar and leaving it there to rise. A woman charged for casting the contents of her privy into the lane at night, when the scavengers had passed. They dug these pits vast and communal, and in doing so they made concentrated wells of disease that poisoned the soil and fouled the air for streets around. The great public latrine at Moorgate, built out over the city wall so its filth dropped into the town ditch below, held 128 seats in a single long row over the running water. There were others. The privy on London Bridge emptied straight into the river beneath the feet of the people who fished it, and beneath the heads of traitors set on spikes above the gate. Picture the sound of it in the morning rush, the stench rising in a wall of heat come July, the flies moving in a low haze from seat to seat, from waste to the food stalls a street away, from the food stall to the open mouth. It was not a fix. It was a monument to a problem no one could solve. The town ditch it drained into, meant once to defend the wall, had by now become a sluggish trench so choked that in some years the city paid gangs to dig it clear, and in most years let it stand and fester through the summer, thick enough in places to walk across. The nobility fared no better. only cleaner in appearance. Bodiam Castle in East Sussex, raised in the 1380s by Sir Edward Dallingridge, a veteran of the French wars grown rich on plunder, as a jewel of English defence, held 28 separate privies. Every one of them dropped its waste straight down a chute into the moat that ringed the walls. That moat was meant to be a bright sheet of water to stop an army, its surface reflecting the towers back at any man who dared approach. Instead, it became a slow, stinking band of sewage, a nursery for the insects that bred in still water, and for every sickness that rides on it. The Lord stood on his battlements and looked down at his own filth curling around his home in a brown ribbon. This was not a failure of the design. This was the design. It worked as intended. The same held at castle after castle, from the coast to the border. The higher the wall, the deeper the pit at its foot. The kings themselves could not escape it. When Henry III wanted a bath at Westminster in the 1200s, servants carried the water by hand and heated it over fires in the yard. His son Edward V had lead pipes laid to bring fresh water to the palace, a marvel of its day, but the waste still had to go somewhere, and somewhere was always the river or the ground. At Windsor, the royal privies fed a single great pit that had to be dug out at heavy cost. Richard II, holding a lavish court, is said to have brought in a new comfort, cloth to wipe the nose, at the very moment his people were dying in heaps outside the palace gate. Even a king ate the eggs of his own worms with his roast swan. And out of this world of rot came one of the strangest truths in the whole history of hygiene. The castle toilet had a name. The garderobe, which means, word for word, the wardrobe. The long vertical shaft of the privy was often built beside a small nook where the lord hung his costly robes of wool and marten fur. He did this on purpose. He believed the sharp ammonia rising off the pit of decaying waste below would kill the lice and fleas hiding in the folds of the cloth. He was right. The concentrated ammonia gas was a real fumigant. It worked. It was very likely the single most effective weapon against parasites that the entire age possessed. Their one reliable cure for the vermin on their skin was the poison gas rising off their own excrement. Their filth was their medicine. The same waste that fouled their water and fed their plagues was also the only thing that could strip the lice from their finest clothes. To be free of the parasite on your body, you had to breathe the poison from your own gut. Every door they opened led into another cell. Every step forward sank them deeper. Now draw the threads together and stand in the middle of the 1340s. A people housed in walls that farmed vermin and rotted their lungs. Drinking water salted with their own waste. Bodies thinned by hunger. Still weak from the great famine of 1315. When 3 years of rain drowned the harvest, the price of grain rose sixfold, and men ate the seed corn and worse. Hollowed out by worms grown in the soil, they fertilized with their own filth. Their wisest men telling them sickness was an imbalance of fluids, and that the lice were born from their own flesh. Their cities heaping waste into pits instead of carrying it away. Over 3 centuries, they had built, stone by stone, the perfect home for a pandemic. The perfect welcome for the rat and the flea that rode it. The disease was already moving toward them. It had broken out of Central Asia, crossed the Silk Road and the Black Sea, and in 1347 reached the trading port of Kaffa on the Crimean coast, where a besieging Mongol army under Jani Beg was said to have flung its own plague dead over the walls with catapults, so the corpses burst on the streets within. The Genoese defenders fled by sea and carried the sickness in the timbers of their ships. It struck Sicily in October 1347, when 12 galleys put in at Messina, with dead and dying men slumped over the oars, and a black swelling rising in the armpits and groins of the living. The port turned the ships away. It was too late. The rats had already gone ashore. By the spring of 1348, it had taken Florence, where the writer Boccaccio watched the bodies pile at the doors of the houses and wrote that the living abandoned the sick, that brother fled from brother, that parents would not tend their own children, and that the dead were tipped into trenches like cargo in the hold of a ship. It swept through Avignon, where the Pope sat, and where the physician Guy de Chauliac stayed at his post and watched and wrote down the two forms of it, one that filled the lungs and killed in 3 days, one that raised swellings and killed in 5. He caught it himself, lanced his own swelling, and lived. Pope Clement VI shut himself between 2 roaring fires on the council of his doctors, and by chance the heat kept the fleas away, and he survived. It reached the French coast. Then, in the summer of 1348, it landed at the small Dorset port of Melcombe, carried off a ship out of Gascony, and moved inland faster than any rider could warn the towns ahead. The Black Death, which took perhaps half the kingdom in 2 years, was no bolt from a clear sky. It was the ending the whole system had been written toward. The chronicler Henry Knighton counted the dead until the counting broke down, and wrote that in the end there were not enough living to bury them, that sheep and cattle wandered the fields with no one to herd them and died in the ditches. In the churchyard of a single London parish, more than 200 bodies a day went into the ground at the peak, until the consecrated earth ran out, and the city bought open land and dug great trenches at Smithfield and East Smithfield, laying the dead in rows, layer upon layer, 5 deep, with a thin skin of soil between. Archaeologists have opened those trenches. They found the bodies just as the record says, packed close, wrapped in shrouds, infants laid on the chests of adults, all of them tumbled in together in the space of a few months. The rats did not cause the disaster. They were only the spark, dropped at last into a country already soaked through and waiting to burn. The deepest tragedy was never that these people were dirty. It was that they were caged, trapped in a world where every wall gave off sickness. They washed their hands in water that gave them the bloody flux. They grew their food in soil that filled them with worms. They gathered close to the fire for warmth, and its smoke slowly turned their lungs to leather. They begged God to lift the plagues their own ignorance had raised with such terrible skill. And when the priests died at the same rate as the flock, and the monasteries emptied, and the bells that should have tolled for the dead fell silent, because no one was left to ring them, some began to wonder whether anyone was listening at all. Whole bands of men took to the roads, whipping themselves bloody to buy God's mercy, and still the dying went on. You would never feel clean again, not for lack of trying, but because in medieval England, clean was a place that did not exist on any map. The enemy was never at the gate. It was already in the wall, already under the skin, and it had all the time in the world. Thank you for staying to the very end. If this story mattered to you, and you believe this kind of history deserves to be told, then subscribe to the channel, like this video, and send it to someone who needs to see it. Tell us in the comments what left the deepest mark. You've just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. Another story is already waiting. A video is rising onto your screen right now. Tap it. The descent is not over.